there were a lot of African men and women who were involved in struggles that rightfully ought to be called Pan Africanists. Gavi formed the first global movement with more than 2 million people. Some called it the Negro country, some called it the black country, some called them the Ubuntu country. These struggles were cultured, couched, determined, formatted, distorted, and inspired by the moments they lived in. All struggle is not an event with a terminal point. Struggle has continuity. I wanted to start off by saying the quest for newness is often the premise of fetish. And because all struggle is not an event with a terminal point, struggle has continuity. So why am I saying this? And I will try and walk us through the notion whether the struggles that predated Gavi and Baldwin and all these other men, there were a lot of African men and women who were involved in struggles that rightfully ought to be called Pan Africanists. These struggles were cultured, couched, determined, formatted, distorted, and inspired by the moments they lived in. You will note that the early Pan-Africanist struggles actually happened within the context of not only slavery, but Christianity and Islam. This whole notion of trying to redeem, having embraced a faith, your identity within the faith. So whether it is what was called Ethiopianism or Abyssinianism, or something that later on was led to the emergence of independent African churches. It was part of that struggle, right? There was a component in that struggle that was linked to universal dignity of all persons of African descent. And it was a dignity derived from two contextual contradictions. The one was a dignity derived from those who were already in the diaspora, having been taken through the slave trade, now yearning and inspired by the Haitian and the Dominican independence processes for a country. Remember, Berlin hasn't happened, so we have not been split up into these little countries. So these guys were searching for a country, a black country. So this search for a country, which means a physical space, this search for an epistemic or intellectual space, this space for a moral and ethical space, this search for a spiritual space, this space, when you come to Gavi and others later on, the space for an economic determinism, how you determine your own economic well-being, shows the continuity of where global development is. So if you plot it on a trajectory from feudalism to slavery, to the first phase of capitalism, to industrial capitalism. So the framing of the conversation was not devoid or abstracted from the context. What was that context of who owned the means of production? Who controlled the relations of production? What determined the value of production and the value of labor in society? And it is useful when we're thinking about this because we can be stuck in whether a new moment necessarily defines a new Pan-Africanism, right? I don't know if I'm making sense. The liberatory project did not start with the 1945 conference. That is a convenience of history writers who wish to limit the liberatory. There were liberatory processes in the 1500s, in the 1600s, in the 1700s that also sought a Pan-African, because we call it Pan Africanism only based on giving of that name. Some called it the Negro country, some called it the black country, some called them the Ubuntu country. They called it all sorts of things. Now, that also means it had contradictions in its emergence, Madam Chair. Blyden believed that the colonization of Egypt, colonial occupation of Egypt and of Liberia was a good thing, right? he believed that for some reason that the ill treatment of the Negro race in America was actually a God-given thing that would force people to actually revolt and come back to Africa. Right? Now, the repatriation movements, which have become the popular in terms of the written word, when people say, when did Pan Africanism begin? They always like to say with the African Americans, with the Afro-Caribbeans. That is not an accurate rendition of history. It was very important for two things. Garvey formed the first global movement with more than 2 million people. So the most organized expression of a Pan-African ambition under Garvey has no parallel elsewhere. It was the first that had women, a women's wing, children's wing, and it had all sorts of things that have been in there. But Garvey was a capitalist in orientation. Garvey and Blyden believed that the role of the Afro-Caribbeans and Afro-America was to come and civilize Africa. So it was a Pan-Africanism that we had in the subcategory black a sense of superiority by virtue of association with slave owners or their diaspora country. It's important for us to understand that as we speak about our Pan-Africanism, we're mindful of the contradictions at the 1901 summit, 1902 summit, 1919, 1945, the question of the representation of women was important. But the question of representation of non-middle class was also important. It was largely middle class meetings. So the first movement in West Africa was driven largely by landed gentry, men of class, higher education, property owners. It's important for us to get this nuance because we then ask ourselves, when did class analysis come into a conversation about Pan-Africanism? It will help us answer, when did gender equality come into this? When did other forms of analysis come in? Remember what I said. The evolution of Pan-Africanism, whether it's as an economic aspiration, a political aspiration, a geographic aspiration, a spiritual aspiration, was linked to where society was in terms of the ownership of the means of production, the mode of production, and where we're going. And it's important for us to then say, what were the continuities of struggle? So the first continuity was racism and violence against persons of color was a dominant theme. So whether you're under feudal or slavery or you're under capitalism, the violence. And today, in a more liberal, nuanced society, you will see that the reason why you have Black Lives Matter as a movement, the reason why you had this I Can't Breathe movement is because the race-based oppression of black folk has continued throughout.